to practice-based research and as a model that can be used for PhD or doctoral studies in creative practice disciplines. The lecture will conclude with a brief introduction to the 15 experimental projects Professor Blythe has selected for inclusion in the Italian Virtual Pavilion at the 17th Venice Architecture Biennale, Italian Virtual Biennale Sezione del Padiglione Italia, for which he is a creative director. Now I want to briefly introduce our guests. Dr. Richard Blythe is professor in architecture and dean of the College of Architecture and Urban Studies at Virginia Tech, USA, and executive director of the Global Forum for Urban and Regional Resilience. Prior to taking up his position at Virginia Tech, he served as dean of the School of Architecture and Design at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia, head of the School of Architecture and Design at RMIT, and deputy head of the School of Architecture at University of Tasmania, where he began his academic career as lecturer. His research career is founded on a passion for creative practice, developing approaches to creative practice research and in building communities of creative practitioner researchers. He has research experience with practice-based PhD models in pioneering schools in the area such as RMIT. He has served in a range of representative roles. He served as a member of Australian Deans of the Built Environment Executive Committee, the Vice Chancellor Representative on the Tasmanian Government's Building and Construction Industries Council, Australia, President of Society of Architectural Historians, Australia and New Zealand, Chair of Australian Institute of Architects National Education Committee, and chair of the Australian Learning and Teaching Council Discipline Scholar Advisory Panel. Also, he was a founding director of the architectural practice TEROA. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are looking for the lecture. Now we will continue with a pre-recorded video for the presentation and then follow it with the live discussion session. And I want to leave the floor to you before the presentation if you want to say something.
Well, thank you very much for your invitation to come and be part of this this process that you're creating here to look at new ways of experimental architecture and then the sort of education and research that goes along with that. It was a very long introduction. No wonder my hair has gone so white. As I was listening to that, the one thing that jumped out to me that it feels less awkward, I guess. The thing that resonates most strongly with me is this idea of passion for experimentation in architecture and trying to find ways in which architecture can engage us as a community, as individuals, as a society, and what role architecture plays today in the kinds of morphed cultural conditions that we live in, and these strange conditions of me as an Australian sitting here in the USA talking to you in Istanbul. It's quite a remarkable idea of what place is and what culture is, and the fact that we can jump online and just before we started this formal part of proceedings, have a wonderful conversation about the things that we're interested in most in our discipline area. To me, that's a fascinating mix of how architecture operates today. And so I hope you enjoy at least how I've explored it. The lecture will look really at my own architecture that I practice with my partners, but I've enjoyed seeing experimental practitioners from all sides of architecture experimenting away and searching out these same themes, and I very much enjoy that polychromatic view. Just one word on the Venice Biennale introduction. Please tell no one that you saw this until May the 1st. Apparently, I am really bad and should not have exposed anything of the Biennale prior to May. So please keep that our secret. There are three-minute videos at the end of the lecture, just as a heads up. So if you could theoretically miss those bits, you won't see the intro to the Biennale. I do think they'll be of interest because the people who made those videos are really wonderful experimental architects themselves. They come at architecture from a very different perspective. sort of three quite different views of experimental architecture at the end of the lecture, and they represent something of what will be in that bigger collection in the Italian Pavilion. So thank you again for the invitation. I look forward to your questions and hearing some of your views on what you're finding as you delve into this question of experimental architecture and how you document that and engage in that from a theoretical perspective, but in a way where the theoretical perspective is deeply embedded in the practice itself rather than as a kind of separate entity, which is something that I understand as part of your ambition and certainly something that I've been very interested in. So thank you, Pashak, for the introduction and look forward to talking to you all shortly.
We also thank you. So I will start the presentation.
Where are you? Where are you? Where are you? When Scott Barnforth, Gerard Reimuth and I set up the Practice Terroir, we were wondering how we would go about making an architecture that would be capable of operating in an effective manner in the kinds of cultural conditions we were seeing emerging around us. And effectively what we were looking at was the way in which our sort of geocultural boundaries had become so expanded, almost to the point of disillusion, that through rapid transport and through rapid communications, digital technologies, we were all becoming capable of being multi-placed. In fact, just like I am here now, both in the United States and with you. So we were wondering how architecture operates in that kind of condition. Why can architecture touch us if we are operating with an almost boundless cultural condition, and where in a way it's impossible to predict the sort of value set and the ways of engaging that that the people that we were designing for would come to our architecture with. So for us, this was a really interesting challenge, and despite the fact that those cultural boundaries seemed to us to be flying out further and further in a very rapid way at the time, and in fact probably still are, what we began to see was that actually the only way for architecture to carry a legitimacy in that condition was to become almost the opposite, to become looking so focusedly inwards, not to some generalized ideas about what architecture was, but to become entirely focused on the situation that you would find the architecture in, on the circumstance, on that mercurial mix of power, of money, of history, of landscape, of the way the economy works, of all these things that come together to make a project. That embedded in that intersection of things, we felt that we could find something that would have a strong legitimacy and allow our architecture to become operable within that kind of context. We were interested in testing out ways of making architecture that responded to what we saw as a failure of canonical ideology. We were interested in modernism, so much the canon of modernist architecture of the 20th century, but in the evolution of human thinking, science, technology and culture, since the period of the Enlightenment. In particular, we observed that the development of rapid transportation and instant communication across previously insurmountable distances had weakened the geopolitical boundaries of culture. These changes accelerated across the 20th century as the supply of energy and water to our industries and homes, the industrialisation of agriculture, and the rollout of the World Wide Web had in turn accelerated this erosion and rendered canonical architecture increasingly impotent, reducing it to little more than a sort of performance performed on behalf of the performer. We could not see the volley of isms that stepped into the vacuum, deconstructionism, postmodernism, and so on, as doing much more than perpetuating the problem. Our interests in this sense overlap with those of Marcus Breitschmidt and Valerio Olgiati's non-representational architecture. But while our interests overlap at a meta level, we had taken a different approach in our search for a new kind of relevancy for architecture. Our approach was to use the techniques and tactics of architecture to work from within that less bounded culture condition in the pursuit of highly subjective situational encounters that work through a deep subjectivity, creating sets of relationships between the material world and us, perhaps not unlike a song captures our emotions and can move us. In a sense, we were feeling our way or making it up as we went along. In doing so, we stumbled into a territory of architectural possibility that, for example, Ignacy de Sola Morales described as weak architecture. The architecture of terroir, as the name suggests, began as an exploration of the making through architecture of effective relationships between landscape, people and technology. The building in which I'm currently presented, Peppermint Bay, was our first building of scale. The project was to create a multifunctional restaurant and tourist destination and included a fine dining space, family dining room and fisherman's bar, in which the client imagined patrons listening to the stories of crusty fishermen returned from sea to their fishing port town that was home to the complex. The concept for the project involved an understanding of the journey to this place by scenic winding road or by boat, prompting us to play with notions of the promenade, the path, and a cinematic understanding of the unfolding of architectural space. We were interested in ways in which these fragments of experience could be reconstructed in the building itself, not in a representational way, but in terms of some experiential familiarity, to, in some sense, situate this building in the landscapes to which it belonged, both the physical landscape and the landscapes painted out through the stories of crusty fishermen or our historical and social landscapes. Think, for example, of Simon Schama's Landscape and Memory. The scenic drive past agricultural buildings, roadside stores in farm sheds, surprisingly permanent despite their appearance. My mother bought apples at Meredith's store well before I was born, and my family continued to buy fresh farm-grown produce there. Although I rather think that Meredith's store is a little like my grandmother's axe, its handle replaced many times, but the same axe nonetheless. Apple boxes made ever-changing Lego-like structures on the side of the road, stacked several stories high and beyond the permissible dimensions of stipulated for buildings within planning regulations, and a gravel quarry that provided crushed brown road gravel to the area. And we embraced the car park and small shed as a familiar tactic for placing the building on the site, but we were challenged by the client's desire to create an iconic experience, something hard to achieve with the limited budget and scale of a modest building in a vast landscape. As we tried to imagine the possibilities for this building, we were grappling with locating and imagining the subject or the subjects of the architecture, the people who would move through these spaces and interact with them. At the time, I was undertaking a cultural theory-oriented PhD researching into the nature of landscape, and in particular concepts such as wilderness. I was contesting what I saw as highly romantic views, an understanding of landscape as a kind of pure condition. And through my research, I was building a case for understanding these kinds of spatial landscape concepts as highly constructed artefacts. The motivation for our interest in landscape came from the place we grew up in, and its divided history of, on the one hand, valuing the productive and resourceful, let's call that pro-dams, and on the other, valuing the aesthetic and ecological, or no-dams. All three of us had been in school during the period of the flooding of Lake Pedder and the ensuing conflict over the construction of the Gordon below Franklin hydro dam that inflamed an international movement and ultimately succeeded in having a large swath of the island on which we lived classified as World Heritage listed wilderness. This was the movement from which green politics emerged onto the world stage, and during which the first green parties were formed. As architects in the act of designing, we were imagining our architecture as a kind of landscape, and certainly as a kind of contraption through which aspects of the landscape became more present to our anticipated and complicated subject of architecture. Let's call her Orlando. We worked with two key spatial notions: to create a spatial compression through the entry sequence as a prelude to a spatial expansion. We used crushed gravel from the local quarry set in resin as the floor surface, and we set up a timber spine that contained a series of posh spaces that provided access and views into the main rooms while accommodating various service and storage needs, including the cellar. The timber spine was made of raw timber of the same species as the apple crates, not symbolic of the apple crates, but carrying a kind of DNA or familial resemblance. We imagined the subject of this architecture tracing a finger along the timber wall, taking in the grain and texture, a sort of bodily connection with the materials made familiar, albeit in a subliminal sense, through the cinematic journey of their arriving at this place. Mark Cousins has described the psychoanalytic challenge of locating the subject, and I retell it here with some license, a story of the subject, Orlando, lost in Paris, studying the metro map plastered to a wall in the subway. Of course, it would be on your phone now. Orlando finds their destination, Pompidou, and then the all-important conformational dot. Vous êtes ici, you are here, at Gare du Nord. But somehow this is insufficient for Orlando, as if the gap between map and body is too much to trust, that the dot is somehow illusory. Am I really here? And so Orlando reaches out, like thousands before, to touch that spot. In fact, so many have made the same touch that the dot has long since disappeared, leaving a small depression in the plaster, into which Orlando inserts her finger in a bodily, material confirmation of presence, of being here, on this map, in this wall. It is perhaps a kind of concrete case of what Merleau-Ponty described as the introjection and projection of self and world. And so, in the terroir architectural imaginary, this Orlando, the complicated subject of architecture, tracing a finger along the apple case timber wall, arrives at a posh. At this point, the building opens out and upward, as if to swallow a large oak tree, and indeed the landscape beyond, gathering it all into a room filled with colour, shadow and movement. This explosion of scale was our architectural way of dealing with an idea of the iconic in the absence of size and budget, an interior space that opens out in a way that causes our Orlando to take a breath, to expand his lungs as if to breathe in a situation that is somehow now more present to him. We had architectural precedents for this idea of the surprising interior in the work of Utzon, of Luce and Pleshnik, and we used the drawing of the Little Prince.
This is not a drawing of a hat, but of an anaconda digesting an elephant, in a move to reveal what was presented on the outside as an agricultural shed, but internally is revealed as a building digesting its landscape. I changed paths in my own PhD study at about this point in the development of the practice, and I swapped over to the RMIT practice-based PhD model under the supervision of one of the key founders of that approach, Professor Leon van Schaik. In the period since, I've been working with colleagues to develop models of practice-based training, PhD training. These various models are, at their core, a way to enable experimental practices of all kinds. I will now locate this first and prior project of terroir within my model of a practice-based PhD and work through the model towards the second project you saw in the pantomime at the beginning of this lecture, the Canberra kiosks, in order to hopefully provide one or two insights into the PhD process itself and to locate these projects in relation to the model. I changed paths in my own PhD study at about this point in the development of the practice, and I swapped over to the RMIT practice-based PhD model under the supervision of one of the key founders of that approach, Professor Leon van Schaik. In the period since, I have been working with colleagues to develop models of practice-based PhD training. My interest in new forms of PhD that work from within the methods of architecture or other creative arts came from an observation that the very point of research is to in some way enhance the disciplinary field. And yet I observed that the kinds of PhD available to architects were bounded within the approaches of other disciplines, history or architectural sciences, for example. The observation is not that there is a deficiency with such approaches, but that there remained a gap that was not being met, a research gap within architecture itself. It was a joke at the time that if you received a PhD in architecture, it was an almost guarantee that you would never design anything interesting again, and that you would be all but utterly unemployable in an architectural practice. And while this crude characterization was just that, there was nonetheless some truth in it. I also observed the irony that those who wrote contemporary histories and theories that used the work of practicing architects as their subject were treated as significant research, whereas the work itself was seen as not research. That also seemed highly problematic to me. I was interested in finding ways to become a better experimental architect, to research using the tools and methods of architecture, despite my formal training in more traditional modes of history and theory research, which I do still highly value. The various models that have been developed are, at their core, a way to enable experimental practices of all kinds. And so I jumped in. I will now take you back through this first project of terroir, completed before I commenced the PhD, and I will locate it within an ideogram that I have developed to explain this particular approach to experimental practice from a research and PhD training perspective. And I will work through the model toward the second project you saw in the pantomime at the beginning of this lecture, the Canberra kiosks, in order to hopefully provide one or two insights into the nature of experimental practice, the PhD process itself, and certainly how that process intersected with our own practice and these projects, and to locate these projects in relation to the model. The starting point for a practice-based PhD is the practice itself, and a first move is to describe that practice. A practice can be understood as being made up of a series of projects produced over time, and we could imagine that one of these circles, each representing a project, is Peppermint Bay. Each project is then also made up of a range of tactics, moves, technologies, and operations that are brought to bear in the making of a project. As the practice is exposed, project by project and operation by operation, it becomes possible to look more closely into the relations between them and to map similarities and differences, but perhaps more importantly, to begin to understand through the evidence of the projects and their operations the intentionality of the practice. That is to say, to describe what it is that the practice is searching for, or in other words, what it is that the practice is researching. Many of the moves described in my opening remarks about how we made Peppermint Bay are in fact observations that came to the surface at the stage of the PhD you see here, not at the time of designing. You see the current point in time represented here with a break line, which slices through incomplete projects and shows emerging on the front edge in dotted form future projects. While there was a historical reflection on the Peppermint Bay project, us looking in the rear-view mirror at what had happened, looking through the evidence of the models and the drawings, the communications, a number of these reflective insights emerged here as we continued to work on new projects. Some aspects of Peppermint Bay would appear in the new project, or some move that we made in the new project would reveal to us something of a tacit knowledge that we had developed at the time of making Peppermint Bay. For me, this is a really interesting aspect to architectural reflection, that it happens in the heat of the moment of making a new project, but that it also isn't simply a reflection of what you already know about a previous project. That in fact, this reflection here, as we make the new project, as we're grappling with how this new project takes shapes, we suddenly see something and we recognize something in a former project that we had not seen or recognized before. In other words, the continual act of making new projects actually changes our historic repertoire of projects, and we see them in new ways. Some aspect of Peppermint Bay would appear in the new project, or some move that we made in the new project would reveal something to us of a tacit knowledge. Completed projects for the practice are therefore examined reflectively in a historical sense, and also through the ongoing production of new projects that themselves become tools of research through which tacit knowledge of former projects is revealed. One of the things being searched for is the intentionality of the practice. What is it you are reaching for? This intentionality might also be understood as a kind of push-me-pull-you effect of the play between urges and fascinations that propel our practice. These urges are the undefined, unarticulated drives that compel the practitioner in practice. They are the fuel of the playful search of designing. In the Peppermint Bay project, the urge was to find an architecture that was somehow interdependent with its place and its situation, and to imagine this from the perspective of the architect's imaginary occupant, our Orlando, the complicated subject of architecture, whose subjectivity would become another interdependency of which the architecture was defined. I couldn't have said anything very much of that at the time of making the building, but I can see that the force of it was there, a sort of blind reaching, and the PhD process became important in the development of a precision about this aspect of our intentionality. Fascinations in the sense of designing might then be understood as those muses or the wonderment to which we return again and again in our architectural imaginary. In the case of Peppermint Bay, the concept of the wilderness garden understood not as an idyllic pre-civilization natural condition, but rather as a human spatial construct was one fascination. The prince and his sated snake, another. Together, these forces can be understood as a field of urges and fascinations. Irish architect Siobhan Nairne took this quite literally, creating a painting of what she called her field of fascinations, fantasy and the fantastic, which you see here as various scales of the island of Ireland, the coastline, the field and the site. You see also a drawing of her house, a locus of her practice, drawn out in full for the first time as part of the PhD, an operation you might call mapping the practice, and for the purpose of providing some insight into the drawing itself, these red marks that you can see are ants from the forest. Siobhan's house set in its field, and including the ants, her island of Ireland, was the wellspring of her practice over decades, and the making of this map was an important step in establishing the ground of that practice. As I went through the early stages of the PhD, a question was raised during a practice research symposium event about how terroir might approach an urban project. It was one of those terrible questions that poke at you in the night. It seemed so simple and yet such a fundamental challenge to terroir's developing self-understanding of its landscape-oriented intentionality. It resulted in sleepless nights, a lot of diagrams and rethinking. It was a kind of productive crisis. As we continued to reflect into the practice, however, we were able to identify that landscape itself was not in fact the driving question of the practice. This example illustrates a possible trap for the PhD candidate, one of the tyranny of the research question. If the research question was framed around landscape, and landscape turned out not to be the right question, where does that leave the research? Of course, good research, both in the practice sense and in more traditional modes, is agile enough to avoid such traps. Questions of landscape had been an important context in which terroir had, through experimentation, begun to establish a unique way of making architecture, one that resonated with our own political, spatial, social histories, and that provided a rich intellectual and aesthetic ground for that experimentation. Landscape as such, however, was somewhat of a scaffold to a deeper theoretical motivation that we were able to discover through the affordances available to us through our fascination with landscape. Landscape had been important for a period of time as a kind of research scaffolding that got us to another place. Researching further into concepts of wilderness would have been a terrible distraction to the research of the practice. For me, the important shift that occurred at this point, one for which you could describe the question of landscape as a transformative trigger, was in arriving at a new level of focus in relation to the underlying intentionality of the practice. To have made the move from landscape to situation, and to better understand the interdependencies discussed above in the formation of the present subject, or in other words, to provide Orlando a stage on which she might manifest her presence. This was an important shift for the practice as we took on our first urban projects. In retrospect, we can see in the PhD model that landscape was a sort of dead end for us, an intentionality line that swerved off our map. This provided the first of these circle or bubble moments, the noticing of something, of a conceptual shift in the research, and then the development of a way of articulating that shift within our community of peers. A second bubble for my research came in my coming to know Orlando, the complicated subject of architecture, in greater detail, and to find more productive ways to work with her in the crafting of a subject-oriented and situated architecture. Terroir's fascination with the subject-object, body-building, self-world set of relations continued to play an important role in how we went about making architecture. Slavoj Žižek's work on the indivisible remainder of the thing with itself provided a model for a kind of continual emergence that was another urge. The concept is in part quite simple, that a thing, as we understand it at any moment, and itself, all of its virtual manifestations, are not evenly divisible. In other words, the impossibility of a thing being entirely present in itself at a single point in time allows for a thing to continue to evolve into something else. For me, it provided a kind of model for understanding how knowledge of something, for example of the rainbow, could never be fully satisfied or complete. What is wonderful is enduring in this sense, and the leftover bit is in a way the virtual potential of the thing. This concept provided us with a helpful critique of Heidegger's notion of essence as it was represented or misrepresented in architectural texts. A sort of fixed notion of essence was something that, due to my constructivist tendencies, I remained suspicious of. Zizek's work on the active subject-object relation was also important. Rather than understanding the role of the object as entirely passive, Zizek reverses the usual logic and discusses ways in which the subject subjects themselves to the object of desire. And this motivation is evidence of the object's objection. Perhaps this is what motivates the lost Orlando to place their finger in the wall of the Paris metro. So in terms of the PhD model, the PRS interactions become an important part of the process, providing a social learning model of questions, productive crises and confirmations, all of which take place in the context of continuing to undertake projects as a tool of reflection and as the research itself. The knowledge of what went on in the architectural production of Peppermint Bay was at the time tacit. The PhD enabled this tacit knowledge to be surfaced, partly through reflecting back on the project and partly in the white-hot moment of creating the next project, in whose surface a new view of Peppermint Bay was reflected on repeated occasions. The PhD reflection on the practice gave rise to an increasing precision about an architectural intent of presencing, a sort of art of seducing Orlando, the complicated subject of architecture. And I have talked previously about this as the tickling object and the ticklish subject. In the architectural imaginary of terroir, a motivation began to appear in the work for a kind of pleasurable irritation as a key to enabling a deeper sense of presence. This created another differentiation with concepts of architecture founded on notions of habitual practice. We were more closely aligned with other notions of experience. Marcelo Stamm described this using Wittgenstein's analogy of a hole in your shoe. An experience happens as a result of an irritation in the surface of things. As the ground presses through the sole of your shoe, you become alert to the hole and to the ground. We are back to Orlando with her finger in the wall of the Paris metro. Incidentally, what you see behind me now is the first version of the ideogram that I am walking you through in this lecture. I thought to show you this in order to make the point that, like projects, the model itself is highly dynamic and continually being refined and remade. Terroir's first big break into institutional architecture came in the form of a commission to design a toilet. It was, in many ways, an ideal terroir project, set on the shores of Lake Burley-Griffin, in a city conceived in landscape terms by its architects Marion Marnie-Griffin and Walter Burley-Griffin. The city is set out according to a triangulated geometry with apexes located on key geographical features. The nation's parliament was located below Capitol Hill. Mitchell, Jurgler and Thorpe buried the new parliament building under the hill, and the geometry radiated out from this point, overlooking the lake. The practical problem was the significant distances of the promenade and the need to provide toilets and kiosk facilities for those who made the walk around the lake's edge. The architectural problem was one of how to do that on the shore of the lake in the foreground of Australia's most significant national view, in which the most admired architectural move to date had been to bury the building underground. You can see the two kiosks here and here. The key that unlocked the design problem was in taking the Griffin's geometry seriously. It was a geometry that relied on a certain angle for completeness. The angle needed to be just so, not too wide, not too narrow in the geometrical conception of the griffins. Now we could see how to be irritating. We projected a line from the Capitol Hill apex through our site, resulting in a slightly odd or obscure geometry, a twist in the object of a few degrees that became noticeable as you move around the small buildings. For us, it was a way of calling out the griffin's geometry and giving it a presence as you went about your business, so to speak. And of course, we needed our anaconda digesting an elephant moment to keep our Orlando, the complicated subject of architecture, fully present, a sort of interior revelation in a building that does not have an inside. This can be summarised in a deceptively simple diagram like so. A circle representing the disciplinary field to which you seek to make a contribution, with a small bump on its edge which indicates the small territory of the contribution you are working toward that will expand the circle of disciplinary knowledge. The PhD comes about also through the establishment of a trajectory for that experimentation that is informed by an understanding of the point in the disciplinary field that the experimentation is directed at. It is necessary then to identify key moments in the experimentation, let's call them discoveries, and to formulate ways in which these might be communicated with peers. At that point, it is possible to bring the PhD together, to document the research that, for practice-based research, takes the form of an exhibition combined with supporting documents. When you see this en masse, when you see many such PhDs researching into and through individual creative practices, you can also see ways in which this research is about much more than individual practices, and the research of individual PhDs can be brought into a disciplinary-wide field of experimentation and research across creative practices. For this year's Venice Architecture Biennale, I am working as a creative director of the Italian Pavilion under curators Alessandro Mellis and Tom Kovac to produce part of the Italian Virtual Pavilion exhibition. And I've chosen to create what I would call a polychromatic view of experimental architecture, and to include particularly those practices that are prepared through architecture to take on what I like to call big, sticky projects. Those projects that are multi-layered, multi-dimensional, that require multidisciplinary attention, and that we must engage with to address significant socio-political, economic, and environmental challenges. I hope you will visit the virtual exhibition, perhaps even the physical one. Let me give you a sneak preview. Just 3 of the 15 projects that I've chosen to demonstrate something of experimental practice as it exists in architecture today.
The dissolution of our states, corporations, social organizations, families, and even bodies into nodes of coherence, that shift according to your perspective, or by the moment, as an equivalent in the human-made landscape, sprawl. No longer do we live in cities, in the countryside, or in the in-between of suburbia. Rather, we move every day through the concatenation of human dwellings and structures for work and play, that spread throughout the landscape we inhabit. This is true at every scale, from the amorphous, increasingly multifunctional objects and rooms that morph according to how, when, or who uses them, and are held together only through rituals and codes of convenience, to the territory we move through as we commute or do our daily rounds, to the global arena that exists both as a space of migration, connection, and exile, and as the virtual space of digital connection whose projections have become our second reality. This world may be ugly, unsustainable, and socially unjust. That does not mean it will go away. We cannot ignore it. We must open our eyes and make it our own. we must make it better. Blacksburg, Virginia, is a small fragment of this amorphous reality held together by the skin of human networks. Originally a small market town, it is now a sprawl of homes, businesses, and educational facilities strung out for many miles along the edge of the New River and continuing into the Blue Ridge Mountains. Its anchor is the 30,000-student main campus of Virginia Tech, which has spawned satellites throughout the territory and beyond. Through its branding, Hokie Nation, and its alumni network, its R&D facilities surround it as a second and third skins, its agricultural stations around the Commonwealth, and its constituents' appetite for institutions, Carilion Clinic, and ever more housing, it has by now permeated landscapes far beyond its physical campus. It is this particular fragment of sprawl that will be the subject of related research and design projects at Virginia Tech starting in the spring of 2021. Depicting and cataloging the elements of sprawl, looking carefully at its actual components without racing to analysis and judgment, will form the basis for much of this work. The real research starts in, and with sprawl. Learning to look, to see, to know, and to understand where we are is the starting point, making us feel at home in this seeming formless reality, so that we may free ourselves from the strictures of monumentality, outdated urban perceptions, the prisons of daily life, and what separates us from our body in both the human-made and the natural world. Let us boldly go explore this brave new world, so that we figure out how to make it more sustainable, open and just, and beautiful.
Urban life has for too long been contained by stuffy apartments and concrete jungles. In contrast, we propose porosity, a porous and green city. As COVID-19 turned densely populated cities into ghost towns, many questioned the future of urban architecture. People feared multi-story dwellings with their little ventilated spaces, while most apartments were not designed for work from home or outdoor space. This prompted us to ask ourselves, what would a post-pandemic architecture look like? We designed porosity as a call for healthier buildings designed to promote cross-ventilation. Long before humans existed, termites were students of cross-ventilation. They built a system of pores to vent breezes and prevent their food from spoiling. Likewise, porosity is built of porous architecture. Instead of long confined corridors, atriums bring in fresh air. The high central space creates a chimney effect, pulling contaminated indoor air out of the building. Most apartments are difficult to adapt to unexpected conditions. Instead, porosity's residents benefit from flexible partitions where working and living can coexist. Meanwhile, every resident has private outdoor space and access to community sky gardens. Rather than relying on concrete or steel, which contribute to global warming, porosity is built of mass timber with fewer carbon emissions. Its unfinished natural wood surfaces also reduce viruses quicker than steel. Throughout history, crises have propelled some of the best architectural movements, like the Japanese metabolists, who designed for the challenges of post-war Tokyo. Today, the pandemic allows us to rethink our built environment. Porosity proposes an architecture that is airy, green, and blends the city with nature.
Cloud 9 2021. What you see here is a map of all the relationships in the project of Keisha Forum Valentia. These are Cloud 9 clusters of knowledge, science of particles, home as a living lab, digital fabrication, performative membranes, light structures, and energy self-sufficient cells. The knowledge of Cloud 9 is enabled by the relationship of La Acacia Foundation, the Watermill Center, El Dole Foundation, Virginia Tech, and Soregi. The leading force in this project is La Acacia Foundation. The knowledge being created in Acacia Forum Valencia is based on the relationships between makers and their craftsmanship. With Kumea and his ceramic work, Krikursa with their glass fabrication, the artist Frederick Amet, Luis Baronda and his digital knowledge, EX Architects operating with timber construction, Javier Pena with Expiral, and including Simon Taylor. This collective network produces a collective intelligence. It is the collective intelligence of this makers that leads the project, not one architect. The project starts by the understanding that there is already a building there, the Agora building by Santiago Calatrava. Our work is to retrofit the building called Agora. The competition renders show the approach of building cells, living organisms inside the structure of Calatrava. Cell number 1, Agora. Cell number 2, brain. Cell number 3, Libraria. Cell number 4, food is culture. Cell number 5, Rambla. Cell number 6, cloud. Cell number 7, auditorio. Cell number 8, stage. Cell number 9, backstage. Cells that activate the dialogue in the public space. I am interested in a museum of contemporary art that becomes a platform. Architecture is building trees. The city of Valencia is a public dream. Agora is a public building. Acacia Forum Valencia is the citizen's home. Cloud 9 2022. The architecture of Cloud 9 aims to retrofit the Agora into a public home.
Vous êtes ici. You are here, at the end of this confession of a situational constructivist with a hole in his shoe.
Thank you very much for the beautiful presentation and being with us today. It was a pleasure to listen to your presentation and being with you here and discuss all the things also. And now I will leave the word to our guests for any questions and comments. And also, if you want to add something after the presentation, we can start with you too.
Thank you.
Well, I will just start. It's always hard to start and ask the first question, so maybe this is going to give time to others to think about it more. Thank you very much. This is very exciting and at some points quite confusing if you are not familiar with this whole process. So I'm talking about my own situation here and trying to get a grasp of things. You are very correct in stating early in the presentation that the classical PhD especially has this very borrowing from other disciplines, not necessarily specific to architecture. And as a result, the process that is presented as being accepted is quite set according to the definition of knowledge by those disciplines. And within those discussions, especially tacit knowledge is something that you explore into, but not necessarily produce as a result of the PhD. And I'm aware of the fact that this research-based, practice-based research, is also not necessarily creating a tacit knowledge, but concentrating on tacit knowledge in the way that almost, how can I say, bringing it into a different realm within the discussion of what is knowledge, the big question of what knowledge is. And I found myself thinking and by deficiency trying to fit certain things into the processes that I'm familiar with. For example, the question of what constitutes research is generally explained by a three-legged diagram. For example, data collection, data analysis, and data interpretation, very specific three issues. And I found myself fighting against trying to fit all your discussions into those three stages and those three steps. Because one of the things that were drilled in my head when I was doing my PhD was the idea that whenever somebody was following my footsteps, reading my PhD, should reach the same results as I was reaching at. And I was bound to explain those processes within these three-legged headlines: data collection, data analysis, and data interpretation. And then, I'm sorry, this is not a question, this is more like thinking about your presentation and doing it out loud. If I don't make sense, I apologize beforehand. And when I was listening to your presentation, I realized that in the process that you are explaining, the intentionality of the design is the research question, and it is the main thing through which we do our explorations. And then data interpretation is not exactly data interpretation maybe, but it depends on very strong theoretical base. And that theoretical base, together with the research question itself, is the one that leads us to the design. And in a way, the analysis itself is how we bring that research question with this theoretical base that is the interpretive device that we use into a result of a design kind of a thing. So you can tell me that I'm completely off in trying to fit this old-fashioned scheme into a completely experimental thing, but I feel like there are certain parallels in which we can bring those issues together. So I'm curious, am I completely off in trying to force such a union of understanding?
Well, no, it was a really interesting discussion, and thank you for that. And even as you were describing the three prongs of that approach to research, I was thinking through that myself as you were saying that. Yeah. Is that going on? And of course, it is going on. There is data collection. So, what is the practice? And this is a question that often surprises people. And one of the disciplines of supervisors working with candidates in this program, bearing in mind some of these candidates have practices that have 10, 15, 20, sometimes even 30 and 40 years worth of work behind them. So these are substantial entities. And when you ask those practitioners, what is your practice, you get an answer, and it might be an answer that you hear an architect give as they do a lecture tour. This is our architecture. One really great example of where, I'll give you two examples of practitioners who in this process suddenly became very aware that what they thought was their practice is not actually their practice. The first one was an Australian practice, Iredale Pedersen Hook, contemporaries of mine, and in fact, Martin Hook and I we had our examination in the same space at the end of the PhD. But Martin was asked, can you show us the practice? And his supervisor, actually we had the same supervisor, said, I will fly to your city and come to your office, and you can explain to me the practice, show me the practice. And so they did that, and Martin had said, look, I think we've completed at least 100 projects. So Leon flew to Perth, Western Australia, to meet Martin, and Martin, his partners tell this story in a very funny way. Martin went into a complete panic. How am I going to show my supervisor the practice? And they had an office just on a small alley in the city. So they decided to take every table that they had in the office out into the alley and set it up down the alley, and to find every model that they could find and place the models on the tables so that they could walk Leon down the tables to say, this is our practice. And the first thing that they discovered was that they hadn't done 100 projects, they'd done 250 projects. So even something as simple as a mathematical understanding of how many projects have been completed is often overlooked. And in many practice-based PhDs, as you just ask for the data to be put on the table, what is the data? Go and find the data, the material. You see practitioners looking at their practice in suddenly new ways. So another example would be the Irish architect Steve Larkin. He's a wonderful, wonderful Irish architect, and he practices out of that kind of deep, brutalist Carnian tradition that only the Irish can do as well and as beautifully as they do. And Steve was explaining his buildings, his interest in the vernacular landscape, and how he works with that in the architecture itself. And he happened to mention that he was a fiddler. He played the Irish fiddle. And we said, oh, so is this, how seriously do you play the fiddle? Do you play the fiddle when you have too many beers, or is this... It turns out he is one of the best contemporary traditional Irish fiddlers in Ireland. And he plays at a very famous venue in Ireland by invitation. And what he does there is to reinvent vernacular forms of Irish music impromptu, in the space with his collaborators as they have a musical conversation, as is the tradition in Irish traditional music. And so we started to say to him, well, Steve, isn't this part of your practice? What part of this headspace is actually also part of the architecture space? Not in a sort of superficial music is architecture kind of transposition, but in a way of deep practice. And he was, by the end of his PhD, he was able to articulate precisely how he was making the same kinds of moves in the music as he was in the architecture. And he was doing that out of the two vernacular landscapes, one of the music and one of the architecture. I find this fascinating because there's no other way to obtain that knowledge. You could not know that about Steve's architecture any other way. It wouldn't matter how many historians he'd discussed it with. It wouldn't have mattered how many theoreticians looked at his work. They would not have got to that understanding. It's not because they're no good at their job, but because it's the kind of knowledge that only he could bring to the surface. It's the tacit knowledge of how he was going about both practices simultaneously. And somewhere back in here, it was they were working off each other, one to make the other better. And so this is part of that rigor of taking the practice and really starting to analyze it, not just in conceptual form. Mine, I was kind of interested in concepts of landscape, which makes mine probably a little more word-based. But what are the artifacts of the practice, and what can we know from the artifacts, the drawings, the diagrams? Is there a gap between what the architect is saying, this is my experimental practice, and then when you actually look at the artifacts or the methods employed, you start to see a gap between what is said about what that is and what the artifacts say it is. This is a really great moment, because then you can say, okay, let's think about that. What's that gap? One more example of a gap, another Irish architect pair, Tactic, also producing very beautiful work. Those two, in fact, practiced out of the same space. So, conversations and coming out of the same architectural background. And when they were presenting their work early on in their PhD, they made a claim. One of the urges, one of the intentions in our architecture is honesty in the expression of material, right? And so instantly my alarm bells go off, because I'm just saying, look, this is what you learnt about architecture when you studied it as part of that great Irish tradition. Nothing wrong with that great Irish tradition. But if you're just using that to say what your architecture is without actually researching into really what it is that you're trying to do, that's a blind spot. And when we're not getting to what your intentionality really is, you're being prevented from getting there by the ideology that you're using to describe what you think it is you're doing. So what I said to them was, well, I'm unsure what you mean there, because when I look at your work, I can see naturally finished timbers, and I can see exposed brickwork, and I notice that you don't treat the concrete. But as soon as you get to steel, you paint it all manner of bright colours. And so I'm wondering, what's the difference in the honesty of painting steel and the finishing? And it was like the question that I received about landscape in my own PhD. It sent them into a turmoil, and they were able to come back and say that their architecture was really, yes, they were interested in materiality, but there was another thing that they were doing with the architecture that really got to the heart of what it was they were bringing. And my feeling is that kind of research is of huge value to historians and to theoreticians, because they get to see, albeit through different kinds of eyes and lens, but they get to see more deeply into the artifacts of how you go about being an architect and making architecture. And they get to see more deeply into actually what went on there. So there is quite a bit of emphasis on also, I didn't speak too much to it in the lecture, and I apologize that there was an editorial error that missed out one little important piece, which was, yes, we're looking into the practice, and we're staying close to the bull, as my friend Marcelo Stamm would say. You must research from close to the bull. You can't research into this kind of creativity from a distance, or to take an objective distance is a kind of madness. You can't get at this knowledge in that way. So you have to come in tight to see it, but you also have to be able to place your effort, your intentionality within a broader disciplinary realm. And that's a really key move, because that's the move whereby you're no longer just obsessed with yourself, as it were, but you're actually saying, look, actually the urges and fascinations that drive my practice, there's groups of practices that also are exploring these territories. And you see this all the time in all sorts of disciplines, not just creative disciplines, but all sorts of science disciplines, the same thing, all sorts of laboratories searching into the same territory. And each one, of course, is intimately understanding of what the other is doing. And if you find musicians, or you find fine artists, or you find architects who are deeply engaged in what they're doing, you often find that characteristic, that yes, they're totally obsessed with what they're doing, but they also know the 20 people that sit around them around the world and who are pushing in the same direction. And that's a really critical part of this method, that yes, it takes on the idea of subjective knowledge, but it does so in a way that it can be shared more broadly. We're not looking for generalizations. You made that really great distinction about some forms of research that go from the really specific out to the generalizable. And the quality of a work of art or a design or a piece of architecture works in a very different way, I think. But that's not to say it's a lesser form of knowledge. And I think that's something that you referred to, the growing understanding of the world of knowledge. And that's certainly something that we're seeing a lot more
of. Can you hear me? I think I have a slight connection problem, but I have one connecting question before. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you. The examples that you have given just now also made me think about a very crucial role of the committee or whoever this person who's pointing things to them, because when you are the designer, sometimes it might be very hard for you to pull yourself out of the work and look at it from the outside and ask those critical questions. What would you say about that? I mean, what is the role of the committee? If there is a committee, I'm assuming that there is, because you are talking about discussing the research together. What is the specific position of the committee in this type of practice-based research?
That is a really great question, and I have literally spent entire day seminars just discussing that one question. So I'll just touch on a couple of things. So I've been involved in this kind of approach in Australia, in Asia, in a number of European countries, and also in the United States. And as you know, PhDs are structured differently really in all of those contexts, but all of them have something like a committee or a supervisory panel. And it is important in this model, particularly the primary person in that committee or supervisory relationship. But I think one of the things that I really value about the various versions of this that I see across Europe and in the States and in Australia is what I would call building this as a social learning model. So not thinking that this is, you know, when I did a research history master's degree at the University of Melbourne, which is very traditional, had a very traditional history program, excellent history program. And I had a fantastic supervisor. I enjoyed it very, very much. But that was about me in my own world, occasionally presenting to a PhD seminar group or something, one-on-one conversations with my supervisor, and then just handing the document over at the end of the day to be assessed. And a lot of PhDs are a bit like that. The work that we've done also reflects into human creativity itself. And it works on an observation that that is very social in its various dimensions. I mean, there are parts of it that become highly, you know, you have to be here, but much of it is really in our, like, just like this kind of conversation. You know, this is, so we try and create a social learning environment. The version that we are operating at the moment at Virginia Tech, we have a committee. So we have a classic American committee. We have a primary person on that committee. We bring the candidates together. And in fact, it just happened on this last weekend. So we bring all the candidates. We've got 11 in that program at the moment. So it's small. There are a couple of these programs now. RMIT was about 180 candidates in multiple countries. Berlin has created a huge program. I think they're up to about 140. KU Leuven and others have got fairly sizable cohorts now, but they have all used this same approach, that we bring the practitioner cohort group together twice per year for a fairly intense period. And depending on the size of your cohort, it takes more or fewer days, but it can take up to a week. And it begins with the examinations. So people presenting their PhD to their examining committee, whoever that is and however it's constituted, depending on the institution, to an audience of their colleagues. So everybody part of the cohort is part of that, and to the examiners, obviously. And some parts of that need to be private, but generally it's a public presentation of the findings of the research. That's a wonderful learning moment for everybody else in the cohort, because you're there, you're just starting, the first time I'm seeing this, I don't know what's going on. And you're looking at this work and you think, oh, I can never do that. That's amazing. But it's part of learning what this is. Then some formal aspects, so some formal research training projects going on associated with the weekend. And then in-progress presentations. And the way that they're structured, the way that we're structuring them is a 1 hour session per candidate and about 20 minutes to present the work in progress at this stage of the PhD. And then about 20 to 30 minutes for discussion with a group of people that are selected by the supervisor or the committee chair, not necessarily the committee. So what you're doing there, and in fact, we extend the invitation to the candidate group as well to say, who would you like us to invite in to respond to your work, talk to your work, and be part of these committees, be part of these review panels. So the review panel has two roles. There's one role, which is me as the chair of the committee. My job is to know where you are in your progress and to keep you heading in the right direction, and also to give a little bit of guidance maybe about what other comments and input you receive. And then others on the review panel are there to respond to your work from the position from which they've been invited, and we ask them to take a generous view to say, don't tell us what you know, can you please look into what this researcher is trying to do, and if you can see ways that you can help them do that better, please let us know. What we don't want is that, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'm interested in Gottfried Semper's view on, we've all seen this play out. And so that's how those intense 2 meetings a year work. RMIT tried different versions of that. They tried 3 times a year. It didn't work. It got too many. And there wasn't enough progress in between those 2 points. When we ran the adapter program in Europe, where we did experiment with some things, we started to experiment with getting the candidates together in groups in between those more formal events. That was highly productive, and that's accelerated now in the Virginia Tech model, and this happened because of COVID. Last year in April, we were due to have one of these events, and of course, it was all closed down. So we rushed around and made a Zoom version of over the 3 days. But that actually helped these candidates understand that even though they were located one in Trinidad and one in Texas and one in Virginia and one somewhere else, they could actually get together on a regular basis, and it was not a problem. They've actually met every single week, sometimes for 3-4 hours as a cohort group, sometimes not with any of the chairs, although Marcelo Stamm seems to be at every single one of them because he's totally fascinated by how this works. And they have that's a really great thing to see, because it helps the research be more situated in what's going on across a broader collection of projects and researchers. So yeah, I think that creating a social learning model where also the candidates become not obsessed with their own research only, but they become aware of the research of their colleagues around them, and they're seeing into that all the time, contributing into it, observations, and that knowing somehow expands their own work very quickly. That's what we've observed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Any questions?
I can ask a question, actually, if it's okay.
Sure.
Currently, technology and the digital mediums provide a new layer in our life and practice. And now can we say the buildings are digesting its landscape also, digital mediums or virtual relations? how can we reflect this digital mediums in our practice as a new layer? How can we merge practice and digital medium? And this finally, this Venice Biennale work actually can be an answer for this question.
You broke up a little bit. I think I got the main parts of the question. Yeah, this question about digital space as such, I mean, not just digital media, but where you're at is one of the things that really prompted us in our thinking about how we wanted to make our architecture. Not that we're certainly not digital architects. We certainly use a lot of digital tools, but many of my friends like Matthias Del Campo or Tom Kovac or a bunch of those people are really, Alyssa Ondrasak, these are all really fantastic digital architects. We're not digital architects in that sense. But for me, the problem of the digital was that it just expanded our sense of what a place is or where we're placed, how we're placed in really new and radical ways. And that's one of the things that really struck me about what the digital does. The digital doesn't change the material. So it's still there. So I would say that the material world is still there, but we have this other, what I think has happened is our understanding of space, of time, of place, of who is part of our cultural set. I mean, you are all clearly part of my cultural set because we can all sit here and have a fantastic conversation about experimental architecture. So if I then tried to draw a line around my culture, sitting here in Blacksburg, Virginia, it's a very odd line. There's not too many people in Blacksburg, Virginia that I can have this conversation with. So my culture is sort of this now porcupine, not something that's defined by my village, as it were. So we're certainly thinking about the digital in that way. You know, one of the things that I became aware of very quickly was the virtual has nothing to do with digital architecture. You know, sort of in architecture school, we kind of get into this bad habit of thinking the virtual is that space in there and the thinness of the screen. But of course, the virtual has existed long before the digital ever appeared. And you could, you know, what's the famous sculpture of the thinker? I could put that in a piece of architecture and say, where is the subject of architecture here? They are somewhere virtual. They're not present in the space. So this is also why I talk about this idea of presencing. What brings you to be present in a space or as part of an architectural interaction at any point in time? When, you know, when I have two teenage girls, when I see them on TikTok or something like that, they're not present, they're somewhere else. You know? So for me, this kind of interplay is really interesting. And the digital, I think, allows us to see the world. We see things differently as a result of the digital that we haven't seen before. I'm convinced that even the way we recognize the world has changed. You know, our eye has changed. It's not that our eye has changed, our brain has changed. And so what we see when we see the digital is in fact a whole new set of geometries based around Mandelbrot's fractals. You know, without Mandelbrot's fractals, none of these images could be reproduced in a way that would be useful to us. We couldn't have video. We can't have the image that's sent to you on your phone or your screen. It doesn't appear there without the ability to reconstitute it through fractal geometries. And so when we're seeing these images and we're seeing the pixels and the things that make them up, we're actually seeing those geometries. We convert them into things that we see as familiar, but we're really actually seeing those geometries. So I think the digital has changed our eye in very important ways. And of course, it does all kinds of handy things for us in terms of the ability to calculate and the ability to continue to extend those geometries in formal ways, you know, to take the digital out of the digital and begin to manifest it in a physical way. So someone like Roland Snooks, for example, in Kikuja, who has done some fascinating digital work. He'd be another really great digital architect in my view. And one of his interest areas is in complex geometries and flocking geometries. And he's a student of Mark Burry and Alyssa Ondrasak, to sort of give you the lineage there. And I remember talking to Roland just before he started the PhD, actually, and asking him what's the problem, Roland, that you're trying to address here. And he said, my problem is I have all these geometries that are digital, but I need to be able to connect these back into some physical presence, and I'd like to understand how to do that. So his PhD actually really became about that move of how you make those connections. And that was a fascinating process. I was, in a peripheral way on the edge of it. So I got to see some of what was going on in his practice there. And it involved even talking to central science laboratories in Australia about how you extract titanium from the ground and what kind of titanium dust they can produce from that, and what kind of three-dimensional laser printers you can use with that sort of titanium to get what kind of output to be able to handle printing the kinds of complex geometries that Roland was playing with. So, it became a whole of economy kind of question all of a sudden, that translation of the digital into the material. And if you go back and read Robin Evans's essay, Translations from Drawing to Building, you see this is not a new problem for architects. This is a new tool set. It's a new way of seeing, just as, say, the development of perspective changed people's understanding of what it was they were seeing. So these are all, I think, really important shifts in the human cultural landscape that architecture plays into and plays a role in. So I think that's a fantastic question. My own answer, part of my own answer to this, I can describe as a building. I entered into a competition to design a museum for Hans Christian Andersen, the Danish fairy tale author. And he wrote wonderful, evocative fairy tales, and the whole Danish imaginary is landscape based. So every single story is in the forest and of the landscape, and these beautiful characters. And I had been living in Denmark for 6 months at the time, so I had a huge appreciation for why people put a candle in their window. If you live in Australia, there is no point putting a candle in your window. First of all, it's going to melt because of the sun. And secondly, no one can see it because the light level is so high that the flame has no impact. But at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon in Denmark, when you put the candle on the window ledge in your house, it illuminates the space beyond. And it's a really particular relationship to space and light and landscape. And so this particular museum was going to be located such that you saw it from above and from a distance. So I wanted to create an information surface. And this was my information surface that was a reaction against something like Times Square. That is not an information surface. That's a delusion surface. It's a disconnection surface. It's a take you from Times Square and put you somewhere else surface. And I was wondering what role architecture can play that's connected to digital capability, but that provides real information about your deep connection to the place that you're in at that point in time. So the idea was to create a three-dimensional carbon surface that had apertures on the outside and the inside, and where you could control the transmission of light through that structure, and where every single aperture, and it was pixelated, so all closely aligned, but where the relationship between each of the apertures was intelligent. So one could talk to the next, and that way you could, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when you metaphorically lit all the candles inside the building, you could see, as you open and shut these apertures, the images of Hans Christian Andersen figures moving across the surface of the building. And so the person in the town making the observation of the building is connected to the deep mythology of Hans Christian Andersen's stories, the connection of light and the forest. And inside the building, with the light coming in, it feels like not like the Arab Institute in Paris, where it was a great attempt at doing something like that, but the camera aperture was so blunt that the transition in light was too harsh. We were working with surfaces that would transition from totally opaque to translucent to completely clear, and you could control that gradient. So it could be done in a much more gradual way, as if the clouds were moving over a forest canopy and you were part of that light, which is actually the light that the human eye is designed for. So for me, this is part of then also connecting those figures to the movement of that light, to the solar system through the sun. You know, you're currently measured in your planetary alignment. If you're watching the Venice Biennale videos and the Agora in Valencia, there was that drone shot that showed a time lapse underneath, and you could see the sun moving across that space. It was just quite incredible. And those kinds of deep connections, you know, for me, what can be missing in the digital surface alone, but that the digital capability that we have now could play a fantastic role in enhancing. So that's where I would go with that. So I think it gives us new material capability, it gives us new geometric capability, and it gives us new intelligent capability and responsiveness. Mark Gilthorpe and Mark Burry and Jane Burry did that beautiful reactive wall. It was quite famous for a while. That was taking information from people walking past and actually able to respond and change shape and so on. Does that answer your question? Is that something along the lines that you were asking?
Thank you for your answer.
Any other questions? While giving time for others, I have a little gossip-like question because of the sneak peek of the Venice Biennale thing. It's not about the Biennale, but is Erin Betsky teaching at Virginia Tech now?
Yes.
Wow. So Taliesin is completely shut down at this point?
Yes, tragically.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Well, good for your school. I think that's a nice win.
It's great for our school. Yeah. And Enrique Ruiz-Gelli as well has joined us. So we have and they are in their different ways. I mean, Aaron is a critic more than an architect, but he's very, very interested in experimental architecture. Mm-hmm. And Enrique Ruiz-Gelli with Cloud9, if you know his work, is experimental in the extremes. It's fantastic to have those two there.
Yeah, very exciting. Nice. I guess there are no other questions, Başak Hocam.
I think yes. We can wait for a while, but I think it's all. Thank you very much again for the presentation, and then also the discussion session. It was very fruitful for us to listen it.
Yes, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you also
again for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Well, and hopefully we can have you in person in Istanbul too when the pandemic and all this craze is over. We hope to have you in Istanbul.
Sounds great. And this is the awkward part where instead of all going and sharing a drink at the bar, we get to press the red button and it just goes like in Aaron's video, and we go on.
Yes. Great. The music choice was nice. I wish we thought about having a soundtrack to the ending of our program, but Road to Nowhere was a good one. It was a good choice. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Great to meet you guys. See you.